We're looking at 3 lessons from 1 million acts of innovation. Welcome to Tea at Taxevity, where you get insights from insiders, our many clients and friends. I'm Pramod Sharma, the actuary at Taxevity. I help people who care about sustainable financial independence harness the power of life and health insurance. Our guest today is Taimour Zaman. Taimour, what do you do when you're not being interviewed?
Hi, Pramod. When I'm not being interviewed, I work. I do a lot of consulting on behalf of many acts of innovation. My spare time, I do karate. I love spending time with my lovely wife and my family and friends. And those are some of the things that I do when I'm not being interviewed.
Okay, thanks for sharing that with us. How do you define innovation?
What I'm going to share with you comes from my chairman, John King, and he said, don't ever define innovation.
Oh.
Because the minute you define innovation, your context becomes that definition. And anything that's innovation, but it's not in your definition, you can't see it or hear it.
Okay.
If this makes sense. And it's kind of a radical different way of kind of looking at what do you mean you don't define innovation. And if you don't define innovation, we get to see innovation. But I get that question asked me a lot, like a lot. Why are you not asking, define innovation? So I'll have version B of my answer.
Okay.
That's what my chairman says. And what I discovered is synthesis.
Okay.
So if you look at the Apple phone as an example, you could say the GPS system was funded by the U.S. government.
Right.
You could say, although the iPhone is somewhat revolutionary, it takes iMusic, or your iTunes, it has GPS, it has your mail, it has internet, whatever. And what's innovative is Apple, and what they've done is synthesis.
Right.
They've incorporated a whole bunch of different thoughts, ideas, products, and services, and they've put it all together in something called the iPhone. Mm-hmm. So how would I define innovation? I would say something that's creating meaningful change, as something that's a synthesis of different existing products, services in any way that's being delivered to you.
Okay, so you have a non-answer and an answer.
I have
Thank
a non-answer and an answer.
When did you start 1 million acts of innovation?
My co-founders, Ted Malucci, who's the CIO of TriDell, John King, who's our chairman, and myself, started Many Acts of Innovation. It was in 2008. So it's been a few years.
And this is a global nonprofit?
And now we've turned to become a global non-for-profit, yes.
Because you're dealing with innovation and you've dealt with a lot of innovators, you've probably picked up some valuable lessons. I was wondering if you could share some of those lessons with us today.
Absolutely. The first one, aha, that I got came actually from a friend of mine. And he suggested that human beings, moment by moment, we are either creating or we're consuming.
Okay.
And only when we are creating is when we come alive. So you and I, moment by moment, we are either creating or we're consuming. And only when you are creating is when you come alive. And creation means so many different things to so many different people, which I think is the brilliance of it. So if you inquire and think about the times you were like jumping in the sky for yourself and calling people and just like wow, excited, it was some version of something that you did that was a creation for you, a creation that occurred for you that got you really excited.
Right.
And let me tell you about Saturday nights. Saturday night, I have a glass of wine. I have my lovely wife, and whatever it is that we're doing, watching TV, going to a game, I'm totally in mode of consumption. I'm not creating anything.
Right.
So there's definitely moments for consumption, but moment by moment, we are creating or consuming, and only when we're creating is when we really come alive. So that was lesson 1 that I learned.
Okay.
Lesson 2 that I learned, I have to give the credit to actually the previous mayor of Toronto, Mayor Ford.
Oh, okay.
And so when Mayor Ford came into power, I don't know if you remember, the first thing he wanted to do was to shave off over $500 million from city expenses. And the proposal was to sell the zoo, close 1 in 4 libraries, lay off 16% of the police and 9% of TTC employees.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember that.
No,
Like
I don't. But okay.
Margaret Atwood went on TV. You know, like don't close the
Oh
libraries.
yes, yeah, I remember she was upset
Right.
about the libraries.
Right. So our group came together and we had to have an inquiry and what could we do to provide something to the city.
Okay.
And lesson two a big lesson that I learned through my Axis of Innovation was through that event and through those activities that my group came in did. And that was the questions. What I got was the power of questions. And when we did our pitch, this was our pitch. If you ask a different question, you have to get a different answer. And that
Okay.
was our pitch to the city. If you want to get a different answer, you have to ask a different question. So what do I mean by that? If I ask the question, how do I shave off $500 million from my expenses? The answer I would come up with would be things like sell the zoo, close 1 in 4 libraries, lay off whoever you have to lay off.
Right.
But what if I ask a different question? What if I ask a question, given the resources the city has, how could we create $500 million of net new revenue?
Interesting.
That would be a
Okay.
different question to ask. Now, a question that's based on creation, based on innovation, engages people. It engages communities. It causes curiosity. It asks, you're asking different sets of questions. So asking, how could the city come up with $500 million of net new revenues? Now that inquires, gets you to notice assets that you didn't have the day before. Perhaps assets that were underutilized. It gets you to look at new ways of inventing value for human beings to come up with new services as an example. So one of the biggest lessons I learned through One Main Axis of Innovation is the nature of the questions you're asking. Is your question based on invention and creation, or is it based on something else?
Right, because the example you're giving, the question was based on scarcity. We don't have enough, we have to cut back. So automatically you're defensive. No, don't touch this, don't touch that, don't touch something else. But the way you're looking at it ties in with your first point about creativity
Right.
and creating. And yes, it's a very different perspective.
Right. And then the third one is CEO of One Main Axis of Innovation in the U.S. I mentioned we're a global company, so we have all our CEOs across Canada or across the world. He taught me this, and it was a distinction called weak ties versus strong ties.
Okay.
So, I've known my lovely wife for 7 years. I pretty much know everything about her. I know her parents, I know her brothers and sisters, I know everything about her, and she knows everything about me. And you could say my relationship to my wife is a strong tie relationship.
I would hope.
You will, right? That's like pretty much, we know everything about each other.
Right.
A weak tie relationship, you could say, would be the relationship between you and I.
Okay.
We met today, or like that. Like I don't know everything about you, and you don't know everything about me, and so
Right.
forth. And so, one of the things we discovered about innovation, it occurs in weak tie relationships, not in strong tie relationships.
Okay. And what do you mean by that?
So I know everything about my wife. My wife knows everything about me. And if you had a camera watching the conversations that we're having, it would be some version of how are you, what you're up to kind of thing. There's really not a lot of new conversations that are occurring in our existing language.
Okay.
In fact, a lot of strong tie relationships, because it's strong tie, if you pay attention to the language and what people are talking about, at some point it's very easy to get into gossip.
Okay.
Because gossip would start from a strong tie relationship. But when you look at a weak tie relationship, when I meet you, I may have some things to share with you that you could learn something from. And you have a lot to share with me that I could learn a lot from. And that's where innovation happens. Creative ideas comes into life. It starts in weak tie relationships.
Okay, because we're more different from each other than we are similar.
Right, exactly.
Okay, and I guess in a strong tie relationship, in some ways you can almost predict what the other person will say.
Right.
And that reduces the value of having to listen to them.
Right.
In the situation here,
And I wouldn't say that to my wife, but yeah.
she's not watching. But in the situation here, I don't really know what you're going to say. You don't know what I'm going to say.
You
and
got it.
some magic could arise from that.
Exactly.
Okay. With your organization, 1 Million Acts of Innovation, what kind of groups or people are you trying to help?
We usually have 4 different sectors that we seem to be focused on. The first sector is the youth.
Okay.
Across the world, different 1 million acts of innovations, we seem to be working with a lot of university and college students. We refer to them as our future leaders. So how do we empower them? We have a belief that, kind of making this up, 80 years ago, there was a guy called Martin Luther King, and he said, I have a dream. And today America has an African-American president. That was 50 years ago. 80 years ago, there was a guy called Gandhi. And he said, India shall be free, and today India is free. So if you look around the world, we don't have Martin Luther King today. We don't have Gandhi today. We don't even have Steve Jobs, unfortunately, today.
Right.
So we believe the next big innovators is our future leaders.
Okay.
So how can within 1 million acts of innovation go in and engage as many future leaders as we could? So that's what big audience that we're running after. The organization that funds our work and our activities, and when it comes to going after students and the youth, naturally becomes government. Government happens to be a big sponsor of that, not always, but they seem to be it. So another stakeholder that we have is government. How do we empower innovative thinking within government, especially when it comes to innovation and engaging youth? Third audience is the business community. They've always been a strong supporter of innovation. They've always been a strong sponsor of our events and activities. And usually it takes, they give us projects to work on with them. They give us ideas. They share a lot of their challenges for us to look at how do we create environments for them to become more innovative. And then the fourth one, and this is specifically in Canada, is newcomers.
Okay.
Companies that hire a lot of newcomers, or companies that have a lot of, I'll use the word newcomers, tend to produce a lot more patents.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When newcomers come into Canada, the trade between Canada and the country they're coming from goes up. Because when newcomers come here, they want supplies from their original country.
Right. Okay.
And then oftentimes when they go back to their country, they export our materials as well. So newcomers becomes a massive influence within Canada. In Canada, we get about just over 225,000 newcomers come here each and every year. So what does that mean? What that means is to a business is you get a chance to speak to 1 million new customers every 4 years. How often do you sit in a country, pick any country you want, where you get a chance to speak to 1 million net new customers every year? So how do we, support newcomers, to support their integration, making sure they're welcome and taken care of, kind of thing. So those are 4 communities of acts of innovation, at least in Canada.
Okay, so you've identified those groups. What kinds of things do you do to help those groups?
For future leaders, we train them on, the careers of the future. Things like digital technologies, where social media, mobile apps, analytics, big data, so on. We train them on these things. We put them into teams. So get training in communications and leadership. And we parachute them into companies. We do programs around what do I want to be when I grow up. We do programs around money. We do programs around productivity, like that. For the government, we create programs to attack youth unemployment. Youth unemployment is predominantly in the developed countries. Youth unemployment is typically twice the national average unemployment rate.
Oh, it's that high.
And if you go to countries like Spain, it goes up to 50%.
Okay.
So who cares? Like, really, who cares? I want you to imagine if I am Al Qaeda, vice president of HR for Al Qaeda.
Mm-hmm.
There's a man who's 90 years old and there's a kid who's 16 years old, and they both don't see a bright future ahead of them. Who's more likely going to sign up?
Mm-hmm.
The kid who's 16 doesn't see a future ahead of them. So we're really aggressively going after helping government attack youth unemployment by looking at how do we engage them. For corporations, they're really interested in creating environments where the people can think outside the box. For people to think and use disruptive innovation as an advantage and ahead of the curve instead of after the curve. So we create a lot of events, seminars, where we create an environment for groups that traditionally wouldn't meet to meet. One of my favorite ones is when we do events where we get musicians and artists to come and talk to business people.
Oh, that is different.
And business is in the business of creating profit. Arts is not in the business of profit. They're out in the world of creativity and innovation. Well, don't businesses need to create and innovate? And could we create a bunch of activities where artists and musicians meet businesses? So that's just one of my favorite stuff.
Those are some very good examples. What happens when you achieve 1 million acts of innovation?
There's a video we have of my co-founder, Ted Melucci. He's a CIO of Tridel, where he talks about, somebody asked him that exact question. What happens when you hit 1 million acts of innovation? He says it's just a figure. It's just a figure. It's just a name. I can't, when we hit 1 million acts of innovation, I'm kind of making the assumption that we either turn the counter back to 0 or do we want to go up to 100 million or something like that? I don't know.
Well, it is inspiring to have a goal like that rather than 100 acts of innovation or
Right.
10,000.
Right.
What's your main message for the people watching today?
They have moment by moment an opportunity to create or consume. And only when they're creating is when they come alive. When they fall into challenges of life, challenges around career, finances, just whatever challenges that life falls into them, my message would be, consider that if you change the question, you have to get a different answer. And a big part of innovation comes from synthesis. So how could we do a lot of synthesis on what you know and what you don't know? And could you think about weak ties versus strong ties? Could you look into your LinkedIn and see who are the weak tie relationships that you have, and could you book some coffee meetings with them?
Thanks. What's the best way for people to reach you?
On Twitter, it's Taimour Zaman. At Twitter, Taimour Zaman. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. If you Google Taimour Zaman or 1 million acts of innovation, I'm sure you'll find my email address and phone number and all the other ways you want to get hold of me.
Thanks very much for dropping by.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for Tea at Taxevity. The Taxevity Insurance Advisory helps you understand insurance and bridges gaps in your coverage. There's no premium for peace of mind. How healthy is your insurance?